And here is, I think, the biggest point of this day of Palm Sunday for us to understand. We lose, for whatever reason, especially in our church, I will say, we lose, I think, a little bit of the richness and understanding of Jesus Christ as the King. And I think we need to develop that a little bit more and have a clearer understanding of that. And that's what my point is in this episode. What is happening here is we're going to see a scenario here that is a royal setting. And Christ as the King, he's going to come in as the royal King and as the King of Kings. And now, what does that mean to these people? Well, remember that with Solomon, for example, Solomon rode in from the Gihon Spring, which is on the east, on a donkey when he would come in into Jerusalem. And this would be, we've talked about this before, but this would be like the procession that you would have, where the king would be coming in and going down this path and then coming up and then ending up at the temple. And this is where we get the idea of make his paths straight and prepare ye the way. That's how I see it, is that the forerunner, like a John the Baptist, would be someone who is calling out repentance and saying the king, who the ideal king is Jehovah, Jesus Christ, is going to be coming down the procession, down the path, and coming into the temple. And so what we want to do is make sure that that road is cleared, that the obstacles are removed, that we make it as straight as possible, and that we prepare the way for that procession so that procession can come through without any problems. Why do we want that? Because we want the king to be able to come through and come into the temple and act as the priest king, as the ruler of heaven and of earth. And so we need to make sure that pathway is cleaned out. We look at that personally. We need our own pathways cleared out so that we could get to our eventual end of ending up at the Holy of Holies in the temple. And that's what would happen each year in ancient Israel, way before the time of Christ. And this is what is lost at the time of Christ, is the idea of the kings and the idea, the temple drama that would happen annually with the king. And this is a very important thing to understand. Many of these traditions would have continued with some of the groups, especially in the wilderness, maybe in Galilee and other places. Remember that the Jews, or the people of Jewish descent in Galilee, were a minority, right? They're scattered out and about around Palestine here and other places, Greece, etc. But some of them held on to these traditions and these teachings that had a more Melchizedek priesthood flair, more of a what we would call a first temple theology. That would be the Temple of Solomon, because the temple that Jesus is about to go to now is the second temple, right? Because the Babylonians destroyed the first one. And in another 35, 40 years, the Romans are going to destroy this one, the second one. But in that temple drama, in the first temple for David and Solomon and the others that followed, what would happen is that the king would come in his procession, just like Jesus is about to do here. And as he came in, there would be a temple drama. And that temple drama had a lot to do with the creation. And the characters in this temple drama would include the king and the queen and others. And the king and the queen would have several roles. First off, they would represent themselves as the earthly leaders of God's kingdom on earth. And that's what they mostly were, right? Now they acted out throughout the year, but they would also change character, and they would become God, and maybe goddess, or the mother of God at least. And so the king would be acting as Jehovah. So he literally would act in this drama with set words that we find in the Psalms. And he would act as Jehovah, and he would go into the Holy of Holies. He would sit on the throne in the Holy of Holies, the throne of God, and act as Jehovah would. Well, besides that, he would also act as all of the citizens that are watching this happening. And by the way, this would happen during the Festival of Tabernacles. So this is where all of the Jews would come in. They would make their booths, or Festival of Booths, Tabernacles. It was called Sukkot, or it's also when we have the Day of Atonement, which makes a lot of sense, right? And there would be certain priestly rituals that would happen at this time. And so as the citizens were participating themselves in this temple drama, they would have a chorus. They would repeat words that they already knew, or that if they had maybe handed out to them as copies. We see the same thing, by the way, with King Benjamin and his speech. That is a almost for sure, that is a Festival of Tabernacles scenario there. And the people are all gathered to go through this temple drama. And a lot of what you read in there, you'll see as drama, is they talk all in one voice. Well, what does that mean? Why would they do that? Well, they've all got the words together. They already know what they're going to say. This is ritual that is happening, right? But that was lost. Remember, the Babylonians took out the temple. It's gone. And what else did they take out? The king. There's no royalty anymore. And so as they go off and get into exile in Babylon, and then they return 70 years later, at the time there's no temple, and there is no longer going to be a king. They get close with a couple things like the Maccabees and other rulers there, but they don't end up with a Davidic king any longer. And so they've lost this. But many sects, Jewish sects, have hung on to, it appears to me, have hung on to these types of traditions, the older traditions of the gospel that were wiped out. And so here something begins to emerge where Jesus is the king. And what does that mean? I mean, what are we talking about? Well, we're going back to Malachi, and we're going back to Zechariah, and we're going back to Isaiah, who talk about the suffering servant and the king. And to me, I think that these are references to temple dramas. They might not be, they might just be written by Isaiah, but I think that these are either references to or actual words of a temple drama that would have been happening in the time of Isaiah and King Hezekiah. But what that would mean as the king then is that you're the king of the people there, but it would also mean that you are Jehovah, right? It would mean that you are the King of Kings and that you are Jehovah. And that was kind of lost. As we talk about the Nehor principle in this podcast, we learned that the concept of the Messiah, the concept of Christ, had been tweaked, in some cases dramatically, by some of these groups. And some of them a little bit, just looking at maybe a war hero or something else like that. But the idea that Jehovah himself was going to come down may have been prevalent in some of these groups, but the idea that he was actually God and was going to take upon him the sins of the world, that was mostly lost at this time. And so here, Christ, Jesus, is coming in like Solomon did on a mule, on a donkey, with these garments that are laid out, the robes of some sort. And so they put the garments on the mule, on the donkey, and then Christ is on the donkey, and he rides in. We kind of have this idea of him riding in right at the gates of the walls of Jerusalem, but that's not true. He goes through the procession, and the people are with him. His followers, his believers, are with him. And remember that this is the time of Passover. So who's there? Everybody. Jerusalem is packed, absolutely packed. People have come in from all over Palestine. They come in from all over the Middle East. We eventually get the Greek Jews that come in, which would be maybe everywhere else. But Jerusalem is absolutely packed, and many of them, if not most or all of them, even from distant areas, have heard of this Jesus, who is said to be by some the Messiah that of old times that had been prophesied of anciently. And so he rides in, and where is he coming from? Like Solomon, he's coming from the east. And think of our temples and how they're built, right? And how significant the east is. We know that the east is where Christ is supposed to come from in the second coming. This is where the king comes from as he goes through his procession to arrive at the temple, which will happen in the second coming also. So Christ is coming in from the east in this procession. And he has these disciples and these followers that are laying down these garments that are being placed down of some sort. And also we hear in John that they also have palms. Now we think of the palms, and I've heard a lot of interpretation on that is kind of something about triumph and maybe about luxuries and something very royal and luxurious that you're supposed to be doing. Here's the problem with that. That's not the best symbolism that you'd be having at this time. We talk about the triumphant entry of Jesus. I don't know what he's triumphing over, at least right now. Now, I mean, most of these people don't know that he's going to be crucified and then resurrect 3 days later. It's a hard thing for them even to understand. Even the apostles don't quite understand what is going on with that. And so I don't know that it is necessarily a triumphant in the sense that he's triumphed already over something. Rather, I think it's ritual. And I think that what is happening here, this would be based a lot on Margaret Barker, the biblical scholar, writes about this. She's fabulous. And she mentions the fact that these look more like things that are happening from not the Feast of Passover and unleavened bread, but from the Feast of Tabernacles, where this temple drama would happen each and every year anciently, 600 years before the time of Christ. And I think she's right on this. I mean, it seems a lot more evidence that this is really what is happening. And we've talked a lot about this competition between Moses and Jehovah, or Moses and the Messiah, where the Jews, at least in Jerusalem, the establishment, we might call them, the theocratic establishment, have put Moses up at the top, right? They've raised Moses up at the very top. And his festival, so to speak, would be, or what they made it into, would be Passover, right? Where Moses takes the children of Israel out of Egypt. And then the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles that happens in September, October, in the fall, would have been about the king, would have been about Jehovah, and includes the Day of Atonement, which is all about the Messiah and the suffering servant. And so here you have the Passover happening where Moses reigns, so to speak. And yet here comes Christ at the beginning of the Passover week as the king from the temple drama, the king that the New Testament opens up with. It's having Matthew show a lineage going back all the way through the Davidic kings. The king of the end of the New Testament that we have, which is in the book of Revelation, where the king is there sitting on his throne. What vision is John having here? It's similar to, if not the same as, that temple drama that they used to have. And so here comes Jesus to be enthroned as the king, or the King Jehovah, the Messiah, the suffering servant that will take on all the sins of the world. And these things that are happening are more in line with what happens in the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles than what happens with Passover.